So what if the end of the Cold War wasn't so clean? What if, in the closed-door meetings between the world superpowers, a secret promise was made to the collapsing Soviet Union? A promise that, once broken, would reshape global politics, plant the seeds of mistrust for decades to come, and lay the groundwork for the conflicts we're seeing today. We're going to examine declassified documents, listen to the conflicting words of the leaders who were actually in the room, and try to uncover the truth behind the secret deal that may have ended the Cold War, and why it still matters so much. The fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989 wasn't just about tearing down a physical barrier. It was a symbol, broadcast live across the globe, of an entire ideology turning to dust. It felt like the perfect ending to a story that had dominated the world for nearly half a century, the Cold War. We were told it was a clean victory, a triumph of freedom over tyranny, the closing of a dark chapter, and the start of a hopeful new era. But history is rarely that neat and tidy, and the simple story we were told might not be the whole story at all. The world on the brink. To get to the heart of this, you have to go back to the chaotic, thrilling days of late 1989 and early 1990. The world was changing so fast, it left leaders and diplomats totally breathless. For 40 years, the Iron Curtain had been a permanent fixture on the map, a stark line dividing east from west. Then, almost overnight, it was gone. The Berlin Wall, that brutal scar running through Germany, wasn't breached by armies, but by ordinary people demanding their freedom. One by one, the Soviet satellite states in Eastern Europe started to fall. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania. The dominoes were tumbling, just in the opposite direction Cold War experts had always feared. In Moscow, Mikhail Gorbachev, the man behind Perestroika and Glasnost, could only watch as the empire he'd inherited fell apart. His reforms, which were meant to save the Soviet system, had unleashed forces he just couldn't control. The Soviet Union was broke, and its authority was shattered. This created a massive geopolitical headache, and it all came down to one question: Germany. With the wall gone, reuniting East and West Germany went from an impossible dream to an urgent political reality. But for the Soviet Union, this was terrifying. A unified Germany would be a powerhouse right in the middle of Europe. For decades, a divided Germany was the ultimate symbol of Soviet control, a buffer zone they had secured at the cost of tens of millions of lives in World War II. The whole thing hinged on a handful of men. In Washington, there was the cautious and experienced President George H.W. Bush and his sharp Secretary of State, James Baker. In West Germany, Chancellor Helmut Kohl, who saw reunification as his historic destiny. And in the Kremlin, a cornered Mikhail Gorbachev, trying to manage a controlled demolition of his empire without bringing the world down with it. The biggest sticking point was NATO. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization was created for one reason: to counter the Soviet Union. For the West, it was completely non-negotiable that a reunified Germany had to be part of NATO. As one American negotiator later put it, letting Germany be neutral was a non-starter. It would create a giant, unstable power vacuum in the heart of Europe. But for Gorbachev, the idea of the Red Army pulling out of East Germany, only to see its sworn enemy, NATO, advance right up to the Polish border, was a strategic nightmare. It was a humiliation he couldn't afford, and a threat that hardliners back home would never accept. It seemed like Moscow held the cards. The treaties that ended World War II gave the Soviet Union, along with the US, Britain, and France, legal authority over Germany. For Germany to reunify, Gorbachev had to say yes. He had to be convinced to let his half of Germany go. The question was, what would he get in return? And this is where the trail begins, in the frantic diplomatic talks of early 1990, where every word was weighed like gold, and a single phrase could change history. The meeting rooms where history was made. Now we go inside the rooms where the deals were being cut. It's 1990, and the fate of Europe is being decided in a whirlwind of meetings between Washington, Moscow, and Bonn. The key piece of evidence for a secret deal comes from a crucial meeting on February 9, 1990. U.S. Secretary of State James Baker is in Moscow to meet with Mikhail Gorbachev. According to declassified memos from both American and Soviet archives, the conversation was candid. Baker put a hypothetical question to Gorbachev. Would he prefer a unified Germany outside of NATO, independent, with no U.S. troops? Or a unified Germany tied to NATO, but with assurances that there would be no extension of NATO's current jurisdiction eastward? And then came the 5 words that would echo for decades. In this speculative back and forth, just floating ideas, Baker told Gorbachev that NATO would not expand, not 1 inch eastward. For anyone who believes the West betrayed Russia, this is the smoking gun. This is the promise. The language seems crystal clear. And it wasn't just Baker. Similar assurances came from other Western leaders. The day after Baker's meeting, West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl told Gorbachev that NATO should not expand its sphere of activity. And West German Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher had said publicly just days before that NATO should declare that an expansion of NATO territory to the east will not happen. Hearing all this, it's easy to see why Russian leaders would later feel like they were tricked. Even former CIA Director Robert Gates, not exactly a friend to the Soviets, later admitted the leadership in Moscow was led to believe that NATO expansion was off the table. That phrase is everything. Led to believe. It hints at a huge disconnect between the spirit of the conversation and what was actually written down later. But like any good investigation, you have to look at the other side. The context of Baker's not 1 inch comment is critical. By his own account, he was just spitballing, testing the waters. In fact, that idea was immediately shot down inside the Bush administration. President Bush was not willing to make any deal that would formally limit NATO's future. The official American position was quickly firmed up. American diplomats insist the conversation was never about whether countries like Poland or Hungary could one day join NATO. The Warsaw Pact still existed, and the idea of its members joining NATO seemed almost impossible at the time. They argue the discussion was only about the specific territory of the former East Germany. The deal being discussed was that if the Soviets let a unified Germany stay in NATO, then NATO wouldn't station foreign troops or nukes in what used to be East Germany. Mikhail Gorbachev's own memory adds another wrinkle. Over the years, he's been inconsistent. In some interviews, especially later on, he complained bitterly about a betrayal, saying the West was rejoicing at having played a trick on the Russians. But in a 2014 interview, he said something that throws a wrench in the whole narrative. He was asked why he didn't demand to get these promises in writing. His answer was stunning. He said, "The topic of NATO expansion was not discussed at all. I am saying this with a full sense of responsibility." So what do we make of all this? Was it a clear promise that was broken? Was it a massive misunderstanding born in the fog of fast-moving diplomacy? Or was it just a case of vague language used by both sides? The West needed to reassure Gorbachev just enough to get German reunification inside NATO. And Gorbachev may have heard what he needed to hear to sell the deal to his skeptical allies back in Moscow. The truth, it seems, is somewhere in the gray area between a handshake and a treaty. But in international law, only one of those is legally binding. The document trail. What was actually signed? Handshakes and verbal assurances are one thing, but the history of nations is written in ink. To find out if there was a real binding deal, we have to move from the hazy words in meeting rooms to the black and white text of an international treaty. The document that officially ended the Cold War's division of Europe was the Treaty on the Final Settlement with Respect to Germany, signed in Moscow on September 12, 1990. It's better known as the 2+4 Treaty for the two Germanys and the four Allied powers of World War II. This document is the most important piece of evidence we have, and it's definitive. The treaty did a few huge things. It granted a reunified Germany full sovereignty, officially ending the rights the four Allied powers had held since 1945. It also finalized Germany's borders, formally recognizing the border with Poland and putting to rest any future territorial claims. But most critically for our question, it laid out the security rules. Article 4 stated that a united Germany could join any alliance it wanted. This was the West's big win. Article 5 then spelled out the specific promises made to the Soviet Union. It said that after Soviet troops left, no foreign armed forces or nuclear weapons could be stationed or deployed in the territory of the former East Germany. The German army would also be downsized. That was the bargain that was struck. The Soviets agreed to a unified Germany in NATO. In return, the territory of the former East Germany got a special, limited military status. So, here's the million-dollar question. What does the 2+4 treaty say about NATO expanding into other countries, like Poland, Hungary, or the Czech Republic? The answer is simple. Nothing. It's completely silent on the issue. There's no article, no clause, no footnote that stops NATO from admitting new members from the old Warsaw Pact. In fact, Article 6 explicitly states that Germany's right to belong to alliances shall not be affected by the present treaty. This meant Germany was a full NATO member, with the same right as anyone else to vote on bringing new countries in. This is the point that historians like Mary Surratt, author of the definitive book on this topic, Not 1 Inch, really drive home. Whatever James Baker said hypothetically in February, the final legally binding treaty signed by everyone 7 months later had no such limitation. Gorbachev, a smart and experienced leader, signed a document that spelled out security details for East German territory, but included no language at all about the broader question of future NATO expansion. So, if the case for a secret deal is built on a binding promise being made and then broken, the paper trail just doesn't back it up. The West didn't break a treaty. The deal that was signed was honored. The deal that Russia later claimed existed one that would forever bar NATO from moving east was never put on paper. It was never signed. And in international relations, an unwritten promise is a political argument, not a legal fact. That distinction would become the source of one of the most damaging grievances in post-Cold War history: the betrayal narrative and its consequences. The Soviet Union officially dissolved on Christmas Day, 1991. The world that came next was dominated by one superpower, the United States. The 1990s actually began with a feeling of partnership. Russia, under its new president, Boris Yeltsin, was seen as a potential friend, maybe even a future member of the Western Club. But the NATO expansion issue didn't just disappear. It got more intense. The newly free nations of Central and Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic had very bitter memories of Soviet control. They saw NATO and its Article 5 collective defense guarantee as their only real security against a future resurgent Russia. They begged Washington to let them in. At first, the Clinton administration tried to find a middle path. They created the Partnership for Peace program, a sort of NATO-like to build military ties without offering full membership. It was an attempt to integrate these countries without angering Moscow. But two events inside Russia changed everything. First, in October 1993, a crisis in Moscow led President Yeltsin to order tanks to shell his own parliament building. Then, in December 1994, Russia launched a brutal war in the breakaway Republic of Chechnya. For leaders in Warsaw and Prague, this was a terrifying flashback. Their argument to Washington became much more urgent. This is exactly why we need to be under the NATO security umbrella. Under this pressure, and seeing a chance to lock in a historic victory, the Clinton administration changed course. The new thinking was that no part of democratic Europe should be off-limits to NATO, the door was thrown wide open. In 1999, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic officially joined the alliance. This was followed by a second wave in 2004 that included the Baltic states Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which had been actual republics inside the Soviet Union. For Russia, this was the ultimate betrayal. Not the betrayal of a treaty, but of the spirit of 1990. To them, it was proof that the reassurances given to Gorbachev were just a temporary trick to get what the West wanted. The feeling in Moscow was that they had peacefully ended their empire, pulled their troops out of Europe, and in return, the West took advantage of their moment of weakness to move a hostile military alliance right up to their doorstep. This story of grievance and betrayal became a pillar of Russian foreign policy, especially after Vladimir Putin came to power in 1999. He famously called the end of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. He has used the "not 1 inch" quote again and again as proof of Western lies, claiming, "They have lied to us many times, made decisions behind our backs, placed us before an accomplished fact." This isn't just for a Russian audience. It's a powerful argument used to justify Russia's actions on the world stage, from opposing American foreign policy to its military interventions in Georgia in 2008 and, most importantly, in Ukraine. The promise of future NATO membership for Ukraine, made in 2008, was seen by the Kremlin as the final red line being crossed. This brings us to the core of the debate today. Was NATO expansion a necessary policy to secure the freedom of millions? Or was it a reckless provocation that ignored Russia's security concerns and cornered a proud nation, creating the very enemy it was meant to contain? Prominent thinkers fall on both sides. Some, like John Mearsheimer, argue the West is to blame for today's crisis with Russia because it carelessly pushed NATO expansion. Others say that's just Russian propaganda meant to excuse its own aggression, and that sovereign nations have every right to choose their own alliances. Regardless of which side you find more convincing, the facts of our investigation are clear. The end of the Cold War was not sealed with a formal, secret deal to limit NATO. It was sealed with a public treaty that did no such thing. But the story didn't end there. We've sifted through the documents and the conflicting stories. If you think this kind of historical detective work is valuable for understanding the forces that shape our world, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We put a huge amount of research into these videos, and your support really does make it all possible. Now, let us know your verdict in the comments. Based on the evidence, do you think it was a deal, a betrayal, or a misunderstanding? We read all the comments and genuinely want to know what you think. So, was there a secret deal that ended the Cold War? The evidence suggests the answer is no. There was no formal secret agreement to permanently stop NATO from expanding eastward. The historical record is clear on that. What we had was a flurry of verbal assurances and hypotheticals, all happening during a geopolitical earthquake. But the legally binding document that everyone signed, the 2+4 Treaty, simply didn't include that restriction. What did exist was a fundamental gap in expectations. The Soviet leadership was led to believe their security would be respected in the new Europe. The West, meanwhile, made specific promises about troops in East Germany while leaving its broader options open. When the West, pushed by the desires of newly free nations and Russia's own aggressive actions, expanded the alliance eastward, Moscow cried foul. They felt the spirit of the 1990 agreement had been shattered, even if the letter of the treaty was intact. The Cold War wasn't ended with a secret handshake, but with a public treaty. And yet, the ghost of a broken promise, whether real or perceived, continues to haunt the 21st century. It's a powerful lesson in how nations deal with each other, that the perception of betrayal, the memory of words spoken in confidence, can be just as powerful as any army. The most dangerous legacy of the Cold War might not be the weapons it left behind, but the words that were and weren't said, and the mistrust that has been growing in their shadow ever since.